let's title this installment of Watch a Knucklehead Fly, How to Track a Glide Slope on Raw Data Without Tearing Your Hair Out. Probably the bane of every sim pilot's existence is a raw data ILS approach, because it seems like no matter what you do, you're always chasing the needle, and you're always overshooting, and you're always a little too high, a little too low, and you're always correcting a little too much. So thanks to a really good video from Jason Miller, this guy right here, called How to Hold a Glide Slope, the Secret That Pro Pilots Know, and the channel is The Finer Points right here on YouTube. This becomes pretty straightforward, and the reason why it becomes straightforward is because you are eliminating as many variables as you possibly can. The trick he teaches is setting up, at least in a light plane, a fixed speed and a fixed rate of descent, and knowing the numbers for your airplane that will get you that, in other words, the power settings that will get you that, and from there on out controlling, and this is counterintuitive for a light plane, controlling your rate of descent with pitch, because it is the most sensitive to pitch, and powering for airspeed. Now, I consulted with my buddy Les, who's got an Arrow 2, which I fly sometimes, and he said a good starting point for flying down a standard glide slope, and obviously with no wind to correct for, is about a 90 knots clean, no flaps, but at some point with gear down the glide slope, and then only putting in flaps at your decision altitude and slowing to about 70 knots when you touch down. So it's a little slower short final than I'm used to, and that's probably a good thing because it'll keep us from floating. And the trick is to apply power and pitch so that you get 500 and you get 90. And roughly speaking, in the real plane, that equates to about 15 inches of manifold and as much as 18 with the gear out. In this model, I don't know. It's reasonably close, and I've sort of gotten the 15 inches of manifold pressure kind of drilled into my head, because that's also a decent amount of throttle to do a fairly decent, just plain old initial descent. So the secret now is to pitch up and slow down to 90, hold altitude at 90, and when the glide slope starts getting about right at the top of this little inner circle here, away, to gently pitch down, keeping the power as close as you can to where it is, to pitch down to a 500 foot per minute rate of descent, or actually with the ground speed that we're going to have, it might be closer to 450 feet per minute, and that will yield us a 3-degree glide slope. And of course that assumes that it's a standard ILS glide slope, which is 3 degrees. Some of them differ very slightly, and some of them differ a lot, and I don't know whether they're technically called even ILS approaches, but what we'll do is we will pitch down to 500 feet per minute, capture 500 feet per minute, and adjust the power so we stay at about 90. And what you'll see, if we do it right, and I make no guarantees here, what you'll see is that this needle will barely budge, and any corrections we will make with small amounts of pitch, not big amounts, and we'll monitor the rate of descent so that as we adjust, we're not taking big chunks and overshooting and undershooting and overshooting and undershooting. Instead, if we know that about 500 feet per minute at 90 will get us the 3 degrees and we're ever so slightly low, we're not going to correct by reducing our rate of descent to almost zero. Instead, we'll try to reduce our rate of descent, 100, 150 feet per minute, monitor this, and then as it starts to trend its way back in, resume going down at the rate of descent that we know is going to keep us on that. So that's what we're going to try to do. I've set it up so there's no wind, and that's always a factor. I'm taking this thing out of pause here, and it might behave a little bit funny. It may take a second for us to stabilize. I made this video pretty successfully about 15 minutes ago, but my microphone wasn't plugged in, and the other mistake I made, or the one or two mistakes I made, was that I let my DG drift from the compass, and I am going to try not to let that happen again. I think it happened when I was diddling around with this or that or the other thing. So let's just set our heading bug to about where we're going to turn when we do intercept. And I'm never really great at intercepting a localizer because I don't do it enough, but the more you do it, the more you'll know that a standard rate turn, when it's so many dots away, will get you a nice clean intercept. And I don't really know that formula yet. I haven't cracked the code, but in the meantime, we'll just sort of thump along and see how we get on, as the mighty Rich at FlightSim 481 would say. And everything else should be copacetic. Again, the point being to know your power setting and to know your configuration and to know the right speed and to know the right rate of descent. And essentially what you're doing is you're reducing your workload to monitoring the performance instead of chasing the performance, instead of picking up the nose, then slowing down, and then adding power, and then seeing a lag, and then overshooting and coming down, and all the rest of that. So we're gonna try as best we can to do this right. So what we'll do is we'll let ourselves descend just a little bit to 3,000 feet, which is the altitude that we want to intercept the glide slope, and we'll just try and be consistent. So we'll come on down a little bit, and we'll get ourselves into a 500 foot per minute descent right now. We'll level off at 3,000. It's going to require just a little more nose down. There we go. We'll catch that. We're a considerable ways out. We're 20 nautical miles away, and you can see the nose coming up because I've got a lot of power in. So here we go. I don't want to retrim. I'm just sort of giving it a little push and holding it right there. We'll look for the localizer to start to move, and we will level off right now. I'm just easing off the pressure, not even pulling back. And we'll level off at just above 3,000. So here comes the localizer. And we'll start to make our turn, I think right about there. 3 degree per second turn. I'm going to shallow it out a little bit because I can see already that nope, I'm going to overshoot it, so I'm going to steepen it up a little bit right here. So we'll come back and catch it from the other side. Luckily we're pretty far out, and I'm going to turn to about 290, and that should bring us back in. There we go. All right, so I'm going to stay right there for a second and just refine the localizer. At this distance, you don't have to make drastic corrections, thank goodness. So we're trimmed out, we're in level flight here, close to level flight. We have no wind to think about, which is good. I'm just waiting for that localizer to come in a little bit, and I'm just going to come onto our runway heading or close to it. You'd obviously put in correction if this were a crosswind situation, but at the moment it's not, because again we want to limit our variables here. So what's going to happen is when I see that glide slope starting to move, I will roll the power down to about 15 pounds of manifold pressure, and I will pull back and maintain level flight and slow down to 90, and then we'll hold it. And I'm just a little bit in between trim settings here, which is irksome. But here we are at 3,000 feet. Oh, caught a little bit of wind, or caught a little bit of something. Just again, I'm just diddling ever so slightly with the localizer. And my trim just went crazy, but that's okay. We'll fix that. We're still below the glide slope, and that's good. Just coming back down to 3,000. I'm just checking my performance here and correcting ever so slightly. Okay, so here comes the glide slope. So I'm going to slow down and get the props full, and I'm going to roll back to about 15 pounds, and I'm going to hold the altitude. Until we come down to 90. I'm going to need less than 15 pounds, it looks like. Retrim so that I'm not making majorly big corrections. So here we come. Slow down again to 90. Drifting a little bit right on the localizer, as you can see. Fix that and retrim. Okay, so there's 90, and I started descending just a little prematurely, so I'm just going to hold that for a little while longer. I'm going to go about 5 degrees to my left, recapture the localizer, and here comes the glide slope. When it hits about the top of that bullseye, we will ease down into our descent. Just trimming to take some of the pressure off. We're ever so slightly low, so we'll go to about 200 feet per minute down until we recapture. We're going to hold that and hold that, and we're going to roll back to 500. Maybe closer to 400. So I'll just retrim for that. A little bit oscillatory. I'm just going to roll off a little bit more power. I think the performance in this airplane is a little bit exuberant, at least in this phase of flight. Okay. Little fast. I'm going to roll out even more power, and when we hit the final approach fix, which is axial, we will throw out the gear. Well, we will deploy the gear, drifting a little bit on my localizer, and I'm putting in a little bit more descent rate. I'm doing that with pitch. Let's just get the gear out now. That will help us enormously. Notice that adds about 200 feet per minute to the descent rate. And there's Aximal coming up. And let's get back to about 500 feet per minute. And now it looks like we're going to need, probably going to need about 15, 16 pounds of manifold. And as soon as I put in that power, what happened was I felt the yoke tighten up and I felt us rise exactly to where we want to be. So now we're going to do our best, just drifting a little to the right again of the localizer. We're going to do our best to do nothing. And it does oscillate a little bit, but you know, we're just trying to keep this picture and that picture and that, and obviously cross-check with this, consistent. And you notice we haven't touched the power at all. We're at 15 pounds. We're at a little bit more than 90, and we're just ever so slightly high, so I'm just going to come down to about 14 pounds. And I'm going to let us drift down a little bit more. I'm losing my heading discipline, as you can see by the localizer. Drifting off just a little bit. We'll recapture that. And notice now I'm going down at about 600 feet per minute, so that will get our glide slope back. So here comes the glide slope again, and I'm going to ease back just ever so slightly. There we go. Still a little bit high. Bring out still more power here. And I'm just correcting my localizer here as well. There we go. Okay, yeah, the performance of this airplane is just a bit much. Notice the localizer is getting more sensitive because we're getting closer to the runway. Okay, I'm going to let the nose come down a little bit more, go down about 700 feet per minute. Yeah, the real airplane is draggier than this. All right. And I'm chasing the localizer quite a bit, as you can see. The glide slope is pretty consistent. Using tiny corrections for that, but I'm going to use a bigger correction for the localizer now, and I'm going to put a little bit of a slip in. That's going to increase our rate of descent. And let us turn a little bit. There we go. We're back on the glide slope. I'm going to take out the slip and just get back to runway heading. We're close to it. There we go, and there we are. Boom. Too white, too red, right on the money. So we'll get one notch of flaps out, we'll check the gear, 3 green, and we'll slow to 70. Now I'm purely visual. A little more practice and we could fly it lower. We could fly it right down to about there. And the power settings are a little bit low. Okay, there's close to 70. There we are. Let's hold that. Retrim. And round out. And flare. And ignore the sound effects there. Did I blow a tire? I don't think so. Well, let's find out. Nope. Just a stickier than average runway and a thumpier than average landing. But that is basically how you do it. You just keep the variables to a minimum. You know the performance numbers for your airplane. And you try to change as little as possible throughout the course of the approach. And consider this also, that when this instrument and this system first came out, it was considered nothing short of a miracle. So to look at it now and be intimidated by it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because if it were really that nasty, really that awful, really that difficult, then back in the day a lot more people would have been flying into hills and losing control and not making their landings or anything else like that, and they weren't. I think the advantage that any good pilot had back then, when instruments like these were introduced, is that they already knew and lived and breathed all the other basics, and having done all of that, then this became a luxury item instead of something to look at and be intimidated by, because they already knew that to keep this thing right here, they had to keep this thing here or wherever, and they had to keep this here or wherever, and they had to keep this here or wherever for their particular airplane, and they knew those numbers, and most pilots do know those numbers. As a matter of fact, every real pilot I know who's owned an airplane for more than a few weeks knows down by heart, almost by feel, almost by sound, just about all the appropriate numbers to make the airplane behave the way it needs to. And I think sim pilots, especially sim pilots who fall into the habit, and goodness knows I do, of flying many, many, many different airplanes because it's fun, don't really pay enough attention to how each particular airplane behaves, and they don't get it into the right side of their brain. So I think if you stick to one plane and you figure out how to make the plane do what you need it to do, then a lot of this stuff won't be that difficult. It'll simply be a matter of refinement and practice and the minor details, not the big things. So I encourage everybody to try it. I also encourage everybody to go to the Finer Points channel here on YouTube and give it a subscribe, give it a like, and on that note, see you all again very, very soon. Bye-bye.